Cool. Well, thank you for doing this. This is Michael.
Hi, everyone.
Do you go by Michael? Do you go
I
by
do.
Mike? But do you
Yeah.
go by
I
your full
prefer
name?
Michael. That's the name in which my mom gave me at the day of birth. So we're going to go for that. People call me Zoff. People call me Mikey. Again, it doesn't really matter. Just call me something that I hear.
Which is fair. And tell people a little bit about what it is you do, what you have been doing in the city, how long maybe you've been in the city.
I'm a fashion designer by trade. I've worked in the city for over 12 years, but I've lived in the city for 5 years.
Oh, wow.
So it's been a process. Again, I grew up in Mississauga, lived with my parents, starting out my career. I had the opportunity to win a really great prize back in 2017, and that sent me on the trajectory of setting up a studio in downtown Toronto.
Nice.
And then pandemic hit, of course, obviously cue the dramatic music. And then the world changed and I transitioned or pivoted or all that BS that people use. We changed our life. And eventually I jumped around from place to place. And I've kind of settled into Old Town, and it's wonderful. So we're literally neighbors. And when you set up this interview, I was like, it would be so weird for me to be at my home, 100 meters away or whatever. It's silly. So it was really nice that we were able to do this. And when you reached out about this opportunity, it was okay, we're going to talk about community, environment, and that's my big thing when I run my businesses. So I do a tailoring business as well as I have Zoff Custom Designs. So under that whole umbrella, we either do custom garments for people from scratch. We might take existing garments and elevate them, or even just alterations tailoring. And I do that out of a space at Ossington and College. It used to be called Shop and Tailor. Now it's Shop and Tailor Studios. So it's a community space for crafters, makers. And I rent month to month. So I'm there 24/7 basically. And then I also work at both Seneca and TMU. So I teach a sewing course at Seneca, as well as I teach a design literacy course, Photoshop, Illustrator, storytelling, that sort of thing, for first, second, and third year type students to take these color theory type courses on. So I'm working with colleagues that were my teachers at one point, and now we are, maybe they're senior colleagues and I'm a junior colleague. And Seneca is all about fashion sewing, and that's a different experience. Again, going up to Scarborough is a different vibe, and the facilities are different. So I'm always someone who doesn't like to have my eggs in just one basket.
No, that's great.
Having different opportunities, being with different communities, and it's fostering those relationships. So
100%. No, but I love that. I think that's kind of even how, when we got to know each other, that's kind of how we met, right? At the end, you reached out to me, and then you brought me to the space, and I loved everything that the space was, and even just teaching that one night of 3D in fashion was such a cool concept. And then you get to connect with communities that I feel maybe are very much underserved by this particular realm, right? I think in terms of the resources that they're getting, it's not necessarily a match for the talent and the desire to actually do this kind of work. So no, it's really great. I feel you also have touch points all around the city, which is also really nice. So that must give you a very holistic view.
And it changes my perspective. When we had met and we had collaborated on that one class, it was about, I was working in a not-for-profit, and it was learning about how can I share community sense to people, just to meet in industry people, or people not necessarily even working in the industry, but they're practicing. And how can that transition look? If you want it as a career, if you want it as a hobby, if you want it as, a creative space to just play, what does that look like? Because it's not necessarily just people who work the standard fashion world, because those people don't really exist anymore.
No.
You have multiple jobs, you have multiple opportunities. And so it's inspiring those youth who might not have that access to it. And then now going into more political space of the minefield of university and colleges, it's okay, how do we work on that process to change it up a little bit so that it's not just such rigid collegiate style learning. It's a little bit more practical based. So whenever I talk to my students, I try to get them into the mindset of calling them designers. So obviously in a marketing sense, I have to treat them like students, mark them in that sense. But I like to transition as much as possible, saying designers, let's get going, or what are we thinking about this, designers, using that terminology, because it changes their perspective and their interest in involvement in the school, especially with this generation that is so glued to their technology. It's like, how do we get them onto
our phones?
Yes, but how do we get them onto technology that, you know, helps them be productive in a work environment?
No, this is amazing, because I feel like one of the key things we're going to talk first maybe about what your journey was like entering this space. And I also want, now that you brought this up, wonder how much of it has it changed now that you're looking at it from a 2024 perspective versus what it was like when you first started, right?
Right.
Mm-hmm. So how did you first get into this space, and what drew you to this space, and then what growth and evolution have you seen in the space since you've been working?
So my first understanding of space, when we identify space, it's the idea of fashion in general. And, you know, as a youngin growing up in like 2008, 2009, when my like world was starting to form as a young teenager, figuring out what I want to do. And Lady Gaga was coming out and seeing all these like pop icon divas, like really focusing on fashion and the whole idea of branding image was really interesting to me, and storytelling. And so that was kind of my formative years. And when I went through my, you know, high school experience, fashion kind of became a little more real. I had an art class, and it was a very like technical, sports focused high school, but we had this little haven of art class, and they created a sewing club halfway through high school. And it was really nice to like kind of play with my hands in a different way, that not necessarily for marks, but just for fun. And so it started really with an owl pincushion that we did this little hand sewing little craft and putting fabrics together. And then we went to fabric stores for a garment project. I thought like, oh yeah, like I can do this. This is cool. This is fun. Then being kind of pushed into, not pushed into, but highly suggested into a co-op role. And I had the opportunity to work at David Dixon. He's a Canadian fashion designer based in Mississauga. So it was actually like 15-minute walk from my high school. And that was a really nice like experience where I could stay in Mississauga, feel comfortable, but grow. And then, you know, seeing what the fashion world could look like, seeing what fashion shows look like. And that was exciting. And then when I got into Ryerson and then now TMU, seeing what like the fashion world actually is like when you're, you know, creating. And my thing was always, I've never wanted to just do my 4 years and then try to get a job. It was like my first day was like, I'm on the job hunt already. And that was my biggest thing. One mentor said, you have to always be on the mindset of, how can I grow? How can I exchange? How can I expand? How can I be a good person in the industry? And what does that mean? Someone who's community. And so it was a big thing learning from David Dixon to TMU experience, where I was participating in fashion shows, meeting new people. And some of the people I'm still in contact with, the graphic designer that I work with a lot on like the projects I don't want to do, we're meeting up for coffee later. And we met at a fashion show. She was a model. She was an OCAD student. And so it's this idea that these connections you can grow and change, and you can stay in contact with. And so that's always been a through line for me. And so understanding this space as, yes, it is fashion world. And I have my suppliers in New York, people in London I love working with, but also who is the community that I've been able to have the opportunity to foster together with in Toronto, and what that looks like. Toronto is a great home base, but at the end of the day, you have this breaking point where you're like, Toronto is great, but how do I make those connections outside of Toronto while keeping Toronto a home base?
Of course.
So it's that idea that, you know, and growth of saying, I'm excited about being here, but how can I grow beyond that?
Beyond this.
And again, not to put in the context of, I always need to be growing. I need to understand levels of plateau or enjoying where I'm at, but then always having that idea of, okay, I could expand a little more if I wanted to. That was my biggest thing during the pandemic, I would say in the last 3 years, of saying, I can grow if I want to grow, and if it's going to create a positive effect in the community. If it's just going to be my own personal gain from it, what's the point? What will I gain out of it? At the end of the day, I'm only gaining maybe financial or ego, like prospect or win, but is that actually going to fulfill me and fulfill the needs that I identify as strong and important? And so that was a really big growth for me. So I stopped doing fashion shows that, you know, needed to happen every 6 months because that's what they tell you. And I had to produce garments and then only sell, you know, custom garments, never sell your samples. When I started doing sample sales, like I did my first one about 3 years ago now, and I'm gearing up for another one in the summer. It's like those garments are just sitting around.
Yeah.
They might be photographed once every 6 months.
Yeah.
If I can make even like $100 off something,
yeah,
great. It's out of my life. It has a new life.
No, 100%. Plus, I also feel like one thing that you really like touched on there is that there has been a shift, right? In terms of like the way that the fashion industry even works now. And I think things like COVID have really changed our mindset. But I also think our mindset and our attachment to fashion has evolved, right?
Yeah.
Like we don't necessarily have this sort of view of fashion is almost inaccessible and it's kind of like at a pedestal level. And then we're like slowly like trying to evolve in our consuming patterns to get to that higher level. I think now people are looking at it more like, hey, I actually can afford something that actually is considered fashionable, a lot more accessible. And I think fast fashion plays a big part in this. But I think that people are feeling like, oh, do I actually need to do this evolution? Or do I actually go to something or piece looks for myself out of like what already exists, right? This big evolution of vintage and people's love of vintage now. So I think that idea of like you selling your samples is really, really powerful, because I feel like that's also reflective of you as a designer who maybe grew up in an environment where you were being told one thing, and now the converse is actually very true, right? So that's really, really key.
Like a really great, like kind of overarching little moment of full circle moment, I would say, would be I made this garment for a fashion show just before I graduated high school. And it was for like, we did it in the Living Arts Center. It was like a whole exciting thing for me. Obviously, it was like, you look back at photos and you're like, oh goodness. But the growth was really interesting. And so I looked and I remembered I did this jacket and I was prepping for a trunk show back in December. I thought, you know what? I'm grabbing stuff from my parents' house in the basement. I thought, you know what? This jacket could be great. Someone might want to buy it. And now I have a customer who was like a person who was always watching the brand, but they were able to buy a sample for $250. Regular, it should be retailing for about $800. And they loved it. We made sure things were like perfect to their fit. They paid for alteration stuff. It was great. And now they were inspired to make a skirt in the matching fabric, because we still had about 10 yards of extra material. And now she's inspired to make more things. But the idea that someone could buy something that was made 10 or 12 years ago and it's still relevant for her now, and then she wants to add to her wardrobe and expand and feel a level of growth that she might not have had in the retail world, where she is very much a person who loves to find designer pieces on sale. That's her big thing, because she, of course, no one wants to spend $3,000 on a blazer. Not many people do. And it's like, when you can find it for $500, of course, it's worth it. But there's a level of value that she puts into her looks and a level of consciousness. And she grew up in the world where people made clothes so she has that already understanding. And so my new business model is not, I'm selling you a collection, this is what you need for this season, but I'm sharing a collection once a year if I really want to. Sometimes I skip it. Like sometimes I go 18 months with doing a collection, and that's for me. But I'm sharing ideas, maybe 10 or 14 pieces, whatever I want to do. And this is what I'm thinking. And they're pieces that are a little bit more size flexible, a little bit more, gender flexible, but not necessarily making it a thing. Or sustainable. Is the idea that sustainability is running a business, being able to cover your costs, but not overcharging your customers and underpaying your employees. We're always paying a fair wage, to myself included, and to the people who are making the garments. I'm able to pay my rent. And that for me is a sustainable business.
Of course. No, 100%. And I think that also like raises a really good question for me. Is like, when it comes to like your creative process, right? There's also a change now in how you're creating, because maybe before you were creating under the pressure of time,
of course,
whereby a collection is coming and therefore you need to quickly draw on inspirations, build your collection out, do all that, right? Whereas now there's maybe this respect of me as a creator wanting to put my offering out, and there isn't this element of time that's tied to it, right? So can you talk a little bit about like what has changed in your creative process? What has inspired you? What's bringing you sort of that kind of what's bringing that spark to you now? Doing this?
So I found out when I really did my first big collection, which was in 2016 it actually was released in 2017, with a show called Toronto Fashion Incubators. They had a Suzanne Rogers Foundation for Emerging Designer, and that was a wonderful opportunity I had a process of. I initially submitted it. This is me almost fresh out of university. And I submitted a collection that I thought was accessible, that was beautiful, and that was garments that would be, you know, approachable. And basically they wrote back to me at like a day after they submitted, and it was actually one of the people on the judging panel, and he said, you know, your collection looks like it could be in Reitmans. Like you are designing for Reitmans. We want better. We know that you can do better than that.
So you're not alone. They're harsh. I have experience with that.
And that's okay. That's the things that we need to hear, because at first you get that response and you're like, oh my God, how dare you? This is beautiful art. But then you think, okay, they want elevated. How can I give them elevated? Because again, this collection, this whole process, I understood from the beginning, you're designing a collection for her. You're not designing it for your clients necessarily, because you want to get that coin, you want to get that money. So she is going to be the ultimate factor. So I started developing it. And then as we went through the process, learning that process of having 5 industry people plus Suzanne herself, it was like you're seeing their responses, you're hearing about their feedback, and you're slowly changing your collection. So at one point, it was about 50%. They're like, oh, you need to have this. I'm seeing these styling elements, but add this instead. And so I did it. Then the next time you did it, and they were like, thank you for doing that. You're getting them on your side in the beginning to one, stay in the competition, but two, continue. And so that process was really critical for me, to take that feedback not as an ego killer, but as an opportunity to grow. So I still include that in my process now. But then, of course, when the pandemic had happened and, you know, we can't communicate with people in the same way, my creative process has changed in the sense that we're not doing that cycle every 6 to 8 months. Because that's not really relevant anymore.
No, 100%.
Overworking yourself and using stories, coming up with a new story every season was not relevant. So from that 2017 collection, it's called Steel Signoras. It was about inspired by the strong Italian women in my family and the people that surround me. And it was very sparkly. It was very glitzy, but it was always like no bullshit evening wear. And that's always what we do with the focus on tailoring and suiting and really great coats. Then we had to do a collection because apparently I was contractually obligated to do a fashion show with Toronto Women's Fashion Week, I believe it was called at the time. And then so we did a collection called Foco Dentro, which means the fire within. And so doing this collection was one, saving face and, you know, not necessarily saving face, but keeping appearances. And so you had to come up with this great concept. We had this really great sparkly background. I even experimented a little bit with budget with fashion film, and that was really fun and cool to like incorporate that in. And essentially it was this idea of really bright and bubbly and intense, but still positive messages. And then, you know, working with a level of fashion production was just a whole different perspective.
Of course.
Again, getting a stylist that really got my vision was really critical. And now when we do collections, it's again a little bit more smaller grassroots. I am the stylist because I have that vision. I don't need to invest in someone else because there's not really many stakes. The clients respect my styling. They love what I do, and I can do all of that. I have a really great team around me that am able to support financially sometimes when we need to, but I can pull it back. So my budgets are not like $10,000-$20,000 a collection anymore. It's maybe half of that or even 40% of that for total production, not just the fashion show.
No, that's amazing, because one thing critical is how, like, when it comes to that element of it, like the production element of it, how much of that has changed for you given like the advent of things like social media and then being able to like in many ways tell the story on your terms, right? Because I think that's the power of social as a whole. Talk a little bit about like what it is that sort of has, you know, kind of allowed you to now operate maybe a little bit low, like with a lower budget, but also like being very truthful and respectful to your vision for whatever that collection is. So my idea is always giving back to the people who are helping you create. So a photographer, you know, the model, the hair and makeup artist. Maybe if you're doing a collaboration with an artist, like my really big goal in the next 5 years
is to bring on an Indigenous artist. I haven't figured out which one yet, and I'm really doing my research to make sure it's truthful, and it's also in the sense of truth and reconciliation. So it's not just doing it for the hype and doing it for the, the clout, but it's like, how is that person involved, not just in the collection, but in the process of designing, and how can I honor their experiences? So the budget is always going towards creating the vision, and it's not necessarily filling my pockets, but it's just to inspire people to get with their community more. And so one of the most recent ones I did was we did the photo shoot at my grandfather's house. So he was selling the home back in 2021, and we got the notice that it was going to be sold end of June 2021. And so I kind of pulled my pants up and I said, middle of May, I was like, okay, we got to get this collection done. We booked the model. I was so excited that she was still on the books, and I was like, okay, let's do it. Let's get her done. And we did it. And again, it wasn't a huge budget. I was able to support the artists involved. But it was really important to me that we had that space. It was basically, we cleared it out, and we're using this really cool peacock space. And one of my friends made a this huge lampshade hat, and it fits so perfectly in the space. And we got the right shots that we needed. We got a cute little video, and it was just about, okay, this is my creative process. This is what makes me happy. This is what inspires people to keep working with me, to, want to feel re-energized and excited, but not necessarily burnt out. And so that was really critical for me as a designer, as me as a creative person, as a community person, to really get that idea out. But it's not just my own anymore. It's a collective. Involved.
And I think having that collective vision, I think, is so key too, because I feel like when it comes to not just hearing your own voice in a story maybe that you're telling, but also because at the end of the day, I feel like, and again, to speak on your behalf, but I feel like creatively, I think we're very influenced by a lot of external elements, a lot of people that are around us, a lot of people that are doing around us, and that sort of drives through it. So when you have a collective like that, that's sort of like the epitome of that entire process for me, at least. That's how I look at it in terms of what it is you've done. When it comes to inspiration, the things that sort of kind of inspire you to want to create, and kind of where are you sourcing inspiration from? Well, I think you talked a little bit about your family and kind of how your family is such a big part of it, which I love. Your heritage is also a really big part of it, which I also love. So how are all of those things sort of inspiring you? What kind of gives, what are you like, oh, I can see this, and I'm like, this is what's going to happen.
Inspiration really comes from anywhere. The most recent collection I did, it was called Garden of Wonder. And so we're also preparing for the second half of this collection. But the first, that collection particularly, it's called the Garden of Wonder. And it's about exploring the inner realities, the inner darknesses, the inner lightnesses of our life. And so throughout this process of that collection, I was playing with this idea of zebra patterns. That's a big thing for me. I love animal prints. And I love identifying with that idea of natural, unnatural kind of feeling. And so this idea of Garden of Wonder was playing with this, what is this almost tacky, playful, overcolored, not necessarily grotesque, but how do we play with this idea of a Garden of Wonder in our mind? And then in my mind at the time, it was like, oh my goodness, my dog is a huge inspiration. And so how do we bring that idea of my dog into it? So it was we had a shirt that I love, a shirt set in green, neon green and lavender purple zebra stripes. And then my friend Natalia, who's a really great embroiderer, she did this text that Big Vinny energy. And so we offer this idea of one, a fun little story for me, but then not limiting my clients. So somebody at the studio really loved this set and was like, I want this. And so I just offered it to them. I said, well, we don't have this in production. It's really one-offs. It's going to cost the same thing, whether it says Big Vinny energy or something custom. What do you want it to say? And so her name is Megan. And so she wanted something that spelled her name, because it's not the classic Megan spelling. It's a little different. So we spelt it the way she did. And we came up with this concept of Megan Wagon. And so she was like, this is so stupid and kitschy. And it feels very sleazy Miami dad vibe whenever you wear this two-piece set. And she was like, this is perfect. This is who I am.
Right.
And so to make someone who is in the fashion industry, to make them feel themselves in a garment in that moment was really, really special for me.
Yeah.
So yes, it exists in my collection, but nothing is set in stone.
Right.
And I'm not very limiting to my clients, because even if they're not spending thousands of dollars, it's small production. So things can be changed as long as it's not like a custom fabric or, you know, major change that costs lots of money. We have clear conversations with our clients. So in essence, my inspiration is the people around me, because they get to guide what the garment looks like at the end. So if someone at the end of a fashion show, and when I rarely do them, they say, oh, I love this, but this one was okay. Usually they're a little bit hard pressed to give you honest feedback, but I'll really know when they give me honest feedback of ones they love. And I'll try to do a little bit of exploration, like kind of pitching like little things that were in the collection. And they'll say, oh, that fabric wasn't really inspiring. Then they'll start, when you ask them the questions, then they'll start being more honest.
Right.
So it's really about having uncovering skills when you are in your creative process, because people won't tell you, especially when you're community-based. They won't tell you because they don't want to hurt your feelings. They don't want to ruin the relationship by maybe hurting your feelings. And the people that are, you know, a little bit more true in my life, or people who know me a little more, they might feel like I'm upset, but they know they don't upset me and hurt me. And we're always growing together. And so there's that like kind of symbiosis of we get each other. We're navigating our feelings, but we're not like breaking egos. We might bruise a little bit, but there's never any damage.
No, that's really important. I feel like that's a really key element of that. And I think like the use of that term, symbiosis, is everything. Because I feel like it needs to feel that way when you are creating others. And like to your point, if everyone around you is inspiring you, you know, and you're giving back in the way that you're giving back, you know, that's really key, because I think you're connecting people, but also you're feeling connected to these people, right?
And that creative process is not just about this is what I want to do, this is what I'm hearing in the world, and that's what I'm done. It's always asking questions. It's circular because of I'm asking questions at the beginning stages. I'm asking questions and while I'm doing the thing. And I'm asking the questions while the thing is happening. And then I'm asking questions when the thing is done and we're getting to the next step. So it's really important that you're always staying in that questioning mindset. There's never an ending. There's always just okay, this is what we've got, this is what we're doing, but we're still asking those questions.
Of course.
So when I did this collection, Garden of Wonder, I was asking the questions, was it too light? Was it too bubbly? Was it too playful? Is there not enough, you know, body diversity? Is there not enough play in the styling? Is there not enough even when we're like that day, the styling, is it not like too femme? Can we get a little more mass? And we're asking the questions to the models themselves, because the models aren't an end process. Even though they might technically be in the traditional fashion sense, those models, even if you're not paying them, it's like a big group show and it's all volunteer, those models still have an opinion. Like I had a male model that was like, are you okay with your hair like this? You know, he's like, I'm not usually into this. This is not my typical styling, but I'll do it. And I was like, but are you sure? Like, I want to make sure you're comfortable, because there's nothing worse than seeing a model who's uncomfortable in something.
Because they're not selling it.
They can't sell it. But he did a great job. And I was like, okay. Like, he wore the same sample. And whenever I wear the sample now, I'm like, I should really get to the gym. Like, not for body dysmorphia or anything, but I'm like, he did look really good. He sold it a little bit better than I could.
I look amazing though.
It's a balance, right?
No, you're
Everybody sells things differly, so you got to know who you are as a person. And then that creative process really can come out. Truly.
Touching a little bit about you know, your experience teaching now and like giving back in the way that you're giving back. Like, if someone was new, how important are the technical elements of creating fashion in today's world? I mean, given that there's such an advent in technology and this is what it is we can do, how important is that aspect of it? How important is the story aspect of it? How important is the visioning? How do all of those elements, like, what is their sort of overall priority?
So I'm teaching storytelling at TMU. It's basically storytelling. The objective is to have, you know, critical design skills in a digital landscape, and that's great. But I'm really pushing the storytelling aspect because a lot of these students are either fashion design, fashion communication, they could be fashion curation, they could even be graphic communications from other programs. So it's not just fashion specific. It's a fairly broad course, and that it doesn't have many requirements other than like it's a year-long course. So you have part 1, part 2, different semesters. And so whenever I'm teaching this course, one, I go in with a space and say, I am the project manager, and each project, you are trying to sell me on why your project should be chosen by the client. That's how you get the best grade. And then we use our rubric to say, okay, these things are critical functions of how to do a baseline good. That's section or level 2. Then level 3 is, okay, you've exceeded that expectation a little bit more. And level 4 is, wow, you really blew it out of the water. You inspired us. You're probably going to get the job. And so there's like that level of understanding and of telling them that, you know, sometimes life happens. You may not get this job in this course, but maybe you're going to get the job in the other course. And so understand that you can't do it all, but you're still doing the best that you can possibly do for baseline, if that's what you need. And so when I'm sharing with these students, when we're talking about storytelling, is even if you're not the best digital designer or creative designer, if you're showing up for class, if you're asking the questions, if you're sharing a vision, a perspective, that is baseline level 3. Even if your digital work isn't amazing, if you have a great story and a perspective to tell, you can improve those digital skills if you practice. But it's really hard to improve storytelling skills if you're not actively listening, if you're not participating.
100%.
And that's a really big thing that I think this semester the students are struggling with. I'm going to be real and honest about that. It's a lot of new learning. A lot of the students are familiar with Photoshop from the first semester. But Illustrator is a really hard program to grasp if you're not practicing with it. And it's actually my preferred program. So for me to kind of feel a little bit underwhelmed by these things, it's like when you go into a space and people just don't know what you're talking about, but you're like a nerd about these things. So it's really trying about sharing that nerdiness of it.
That's true.
And so when we're doing this creative process and we're also sharing this vision and how students and people who are emerging designers, how they can be more successful, is simply just take a break. Have a notebook, have a Google Drive, have a place for inspiration, and always put in things that you love.
I love that.
And so making whatever, even if it's a voice note on your phone, a little notes app, whatever, the way you curate, the way you scrapbook, the way you whatever. Because there'll be a time when you can be like, oh, I remember this J.W. Anderson collection from da-da-da, or this silly movie I saw at a film festival. And like, just explaining to them as, you know, creatives, freelancers, small business owners, if you do something that is adventurous, cultural, or whatever, it's a business expense.
100%.
So as long as you're documenting all of these experiences you've had, if you show a collection, like I've shown a collection that was directly inspired by a sidewalk painting I had in New York. And I have that in my Google Drive. And so if CRA tries to come for me, I can be like, boop, boop, boop.
This is where it's all connected.
And then it's a little bit harder pressed for them to be like, you can't justify that trip. I can, because it is directly in a published work.
100%. I also feel like that's the challenge also with like, you know, with any time, any institution like the CRA is looking at a creative space, is like, they're looking at it like, oh, like how did all of this come together?
To this,
right? Like they're just looking at the end product and wondering, okay, the end product doesn't justify like all of what happened.
But if you have objective, physical, or like tangible things,
100%.
Then it's more understandable for people who aren't as subjective or as creative as maybe you are. It's easier to connect the dots. So you kind of have to always think in that mindset of tangible, rational, or connective things, and then also your ideas. That's the creative process, is taking what's existing in the world, taking what's existing in your brain, and trying to meet it in some sort of medium. And I think that's in essence, that's it. That's all
really, really cool. I think like a couple of things that really resonate with me. I think like having the ideas down is really, really key. I mean, I once tried to show someone my weird sketches that I would make, like, as I'm walking, because sometimes like the idea will just come to you as you do something else, right? But I also think one thing that you really touched on there is, tools like Illustrator and kind of the importance of a tool like Illustrator. I think personally, like when I did try to go into fashion, I think, and this is maybe why I create fashion films now, is because I felt very impeded by that technical aspect of it. And in fact, my first collection of bags was all built in Illustrator, because I only knew how to use Illustrator, and I had a laser cutter. And I was like, oh, those two things together, I was like, this could work. Maybe this is how I'm forming my vision. I think that's really important, like to even give the students that ability to sort of connect that process, to be like, don't feel impeded by the doing element of it, as long as what is there is very cohesive, like the idea is really cohesive. The execution can come through in many different ways. And that's really, really key.
And letting students know about like budgeting. So like maybe you need a technology. Does the school have access to it? How do you can get access to it? How can you ask for the school to pay for technology to get that? Like a big emerging technology obviously is Clo. And that's a really big one, obviously, like for your work. And me pushing for students to learn this technology if they want to get into a field like technical design. Because I have a friend who works at Joe Fresh. And so he was actually also a guest speaker in that same series. And he was also talking about Clo and technology and sharing that experience of how do you piece together your technical skills and then also play with it in more industrious way rather than just a creative way, because creative is excellent for a fashion show, for a fashion video, what have you, but how do you play with it in a way where you can test out a sample even before it's made? And so in a Joe Fresh sense, they have full labs and setup, and he uses that technology on a daily basis, basically. And so it's how do you connect that idea of industry versus creativity, and that works hand in hand. He's not necessarily doing the most glamorous or out there pieces. You know, max his pieces are $40 in the store, but he has that technical skill and creative skill to make it happen. And so the creative process doesn't have to be just the most beautiful, glamorous, exciting, sexy pieces. It can also be for things that are industrious.
No, it's 100% that. Like, I think that's the joy of something like Clo or like Marvelous, is like you can really, you feel very unbounded by what it is. I mean, granted, those technologies are also, they're sort of gate kept by their prices, which is its own story. And that's why I kind of like, I tend to do a lot of it in Blender, but that's an interesting, like, sort of way to look at it, is to say that you should never feel tied to what your ideas are, because right now I feel like we're in a space where your ideas could be anything. The execution can be anything. Right? So that's really, really key. Just to kind of sort of round everything out together, what is one thing that you would love to leave people with, thought-wise, or maybe a suggestion, maybe an idea, maybe something you enjoyed, that you feel will be of value to them, and to, because they're all a part of your community. So
my biggest thing is understand the access and the privileges that you have, and then use those accesses and privileges to the best of your abilities in the most positive way, of course. I had someone who reached out to me about a grant, but they were unsure about the grant owner's like intentions or like political views. And they were like, it's a really high time. I don't know, will I seem like a person who's like going back on their community by doing it? And I looked at the message. We didn't chat in person, but I looked at the message and I was immediately like, mouth drop. And then my immediate like visceral response was, take the grant. If you have access to doing it. And they did. And it's great seeing them have that financial security. Because even though we want to create a beautiful environment of, living in a vacuum and being like this full-rounded experience, we still have to have capitalism.
You have
to survive. You can have conversations about anti-capitalism, and that can be in your work, but you also have to know the systems in which you play.
Of course.
And if you don't have that funding, you won't be able to get your idea out there. Someone who doesn't have your ideas might get that instead. So it's not necessarily a rat race, but it's an idea of understanding what the systems are in play, what you have access to, what you don't have access to, and maybe how you can get there. I really understood that process years ago, but I didn't really put into practice from a client. And she was starting her finance business from the ground up, single mother, not many prospects, but she really wanted to get in this industry. And so she would take meetings with bankers and bank executives and figuring out what they needed. And all she asked, she would sometimes pester them and say, I need 5 minutes of your time, not longer, not less. What works in your schedule? Oh, you have 9:05 to 9:10 when you're walking to your office. I'll take it. Okay. I'll meet you at your coffee shop and I'll get you a coffee. I'll hand in hand 9:05 on the dot. She'd be there 9:04 with the coffee just in case. And she would say she would get really important information just by asking questions. Yeah, of course. And that's how she got access to spaces. She doesn't identify as an old white man at the time, so figure it out. How do you get there? That was her system. And so taking that idea of putting the wedge in the system that you want to get into to live the life that you want, it's not going to happen quickly. No. But you can get there if you understand the roadmap.
Of course.
So figure out your roadmap, get to where you're going, but know that roadmap, it'll change.
I feel like that's just the dynamic of life too, right? Like you can't predict everything that's going to happen. Yeah. So you kind of are almost just like, you have a rough sort of shell of it, and then you kind of like build it out from there. Where can people find you now, and what are you doing that you want to share with people?
People can find me on the interwebs. They can find me at zoffranieri.com, so my last name.com. Yeah. They can also find me on Instagram at Zoffranieri, my last name, or at Zoff Tailoring, depending on what you need. Yes. Email is best. I really am understanding about answering the bell. It's like a concept in like a self-help book or something. So answering only emails. Fair. Don't DM me for big projects. Okay. That's a nice intro.
That's important.
But emails are really good if you want to really like make some money together. Yeah. And you can also find me at Shop and Tailor by appointment only via email.
Awesome. Thank you so much for doing this. And I feel like I've learned so much. I think you've given me a lot to think about too, which I think is really key. And I think you've given a lot of, thoughts to other people out there. So hopefully we'll do this again and maybe we'll catch up and see where we're at like in the future.
I would love that.